In the beautiful land of Africa, the quiet village of Lusaka, a young girl named Zola lived a simple but happy life with her loving mother. But happiness is often short-lived, and fate had its own cruel plans. When Zola's mother fell ill and passed away, her world shattered. Her father, lost in grief and desperate for help, remarried a woman named Boule, hoping she would bring warmth back into their home. But Boule did not come alone. She brought with her a new husband, Fumero, a man whose heart was as dark as the stormy night sky. At first, Fumero hid his true nature behind a fake smile, pretending to care for Zola. But in his eyes, she was nothing more than an unwanted burden. He was a greedy man who desired power, control, and wealth. Zola, with her innocence and purity, was a thorn in his plans. He wanted the household, the land, and most importantly, absolute rule over Boule's decisions. But as long as Zola existed, her father's love and protection would always stand in his way. One evening, as the village elders gathered under the great baobab tree, their voices carried in the wind. They spoke of an ancient prophecy, one that sent a chill down Fumero's spine. "A child with a sacred mark will bring great fortune to this land," an elder declared. "The rivers will rise for her, the earth will bloom in her presence, and those who wrong her shall face the wrath of the spirits." Fumero's blood ran cold. He had noticed the strange birthmark on Zola's arm before, but he had never thought much of it. Now, the realization hit him like a raging storm. Could this foolish little girl be the one from the prophecy? Could she be destined for something greater than all of them? If so, he couldn't allow it. He had spent years clawing his way to power, manipulating Boule, and securing his position in the household. He would not let a mere child ruin it all. That night, as the village slept, Fumero sat in the darkness, his mind racing with wicked thoughts. His hatred for Zola burned brighter than ever before. There was only one solution. He had to get rid of her, forever. The moment Fumero connected the prophecy to Zola, a deep fear settled inside him, twisting into hatred. He could not let a mere girl stand in his way. If the prophecy was true, then one day Zola would rise to greatness, and he, Fumero, would be nothing but a shadow in her story. He refused to let that happen. The only way to ensure his power remained untouched was to erase her from existence. But he had to be careful. If he harmed her openly, the villagers might suspect something. He needed an excuse, a reason that would make Boule stand by his side and not question his actions. So he planted a seed of fear in her mind. Late one evening, as the dim lantern light flickered between them, Fumero leaned in close to Boule, his voice low and urgent. "That girl," he whispered, "she is cursed." Boule frowned, confused, but he continued before she could protest. "You've seen the way strange things happen around her, the way the wind changes when she cries, the way animals seem to watch her. She is not normal, Boule. The prophecy is real, and if she stays, she will bring disaster upon us." Boule hesitated. Deep down, she did not believe Zola was dangerous, but Fumero's words crawled into her heart like a sickness. She had noticed the mark on the girl's arm, the way it almost seemed to glow under the moonlight. And what if, just what if, Fumero was right? What if keeping Zola meant angering the spirits? What if their family was doomed because of her? Fumero saw the uncertainty in her eyes and knew he had won. That night, as the village lay in deep slumber, he moved with deadly intent. He stepped into Zola's small room, his presence filling the space like a dark cloud. The girl stirred, her sleepy eyes barely registering what was happening before rough hands grabbed her. A gasp barely escaped her lips before he covered her mouth. "Not a sound," he hissed, "or you will regret it." Terror seized Zola's small body as Fumero dragged her through the empty pathways of the village. The night was silent, except for the rustling of leaves and the distant sound of the river ahead. She struggled, but his grip was like iron. Her bare feet stumbled over rocks and roots, but he never slowed down. The closer they got to the water, the stronger the fear inside her grew. The river was wild that night, its dark waves crashing against the shore like an angry beast. Zola's heart pounded as she saw the rope and the heavy rock waiting for her. Reality hit her like a blow. Fumero wasn't just trying to scare her, he was going to kill her. "Please," she finally managed to whisper, her voice shaking. "What have I done?" Fumero didn't answer. His hands worked quickly, tying the rope around her small ankles, fastening it to the stone. Boule stood a few steps away, her face pale, her arms wrapped around herself as if trying to hold in her own fear. She did not stop him. She did not fight for Zola. She only watched. The cold touch of the water on her skin sent a shock through Zola's body. The river lapped at her feet, rising higher, stealing her breath with its icy fingers. She kicked, screamed, begged, but Fumiro did not hesitate. With one final shove, he sent her plunging into the darkness. The last thing Zola saw before the water swallowed her whole was the blank, unreadable face of Bool, silent, watching, doing nothing, and then nothing but the cold, endless blackness of the river. The icy darkness swallowed Zola whole. The weight of the stone pulled her downward, dragging her deeper into the river's cold embrace. Water rushed into her nose and mouth, choking her. Her tiny hands clawed at the rope around her ankles, but it was too tight. Her lungs burned. Fear wrapped around her like the river itself, whispering that this was the end. Then, something strange happened. Just as she was about to lose consciousness, the water around her began to glow. Soft golden light swirled in the depths, wrapping around her like warm hands. The current that had once threatened to drown her suddenly shifted. Instead of dragging her down, it lifted her. The weight on her ankles disappeared, the rope unraveling as if unseen fingers had freed her. The rock that had been meant to kill her sank into the darkness below, but Zola remained suspended, floating in a pool of shimmering light. She gasped, filling her lungs with something impossible. Air. How could she breathe underwater? Panic turned to confusion as she looked around. The river was no longer dark and terrifying. It was alive. The water pulsed like a heartbeat, and strange figures moved within it. Then they appeared. Tall, ethereal beings with skin like the river's surface, and eyes that glowed like moonlight. Their hair flowed like liquid silver, their robes shifting like waves. They surrounded her, watching her with deep, knowing eyes. One of them, an elder with lines on his face like ripples on a calm lake, stepped forward. His presence was strong yet peaceful, like the stillness before a great storm. "Do not be afraid, child," his voice echoed, not in her ears, but in her mind. "You are one of us now." Zola's lips trembled. Who are you?" "We are the river keepers," he answered, "the guardians of these sacred waters. And you, Zola, are marked by the gods." She frowned, not understanding. Marked? What did that mean? Why had the river saved her? Why had these beings appeared now? The elder's gaze softened as if he could hear her thoughts. "The world above has rejected you, but the river has claimed you. You were never meant to perish in its depths. You were meant to rise." A strange feeling stirred in her chest. Hope, a feeling she thought had drowned with her. Elder Mawira, as the others called him, reached out a hand. "Come, child, you have much to learn." And so, Zola followed. Deep beneath the waters, hidden from the eyes of the world, Zola was reborn. The river keepers became her new family, their realm, her new home. They taught her the secrets of the river, how to read the currents, how to listen to the whispers of the water, how to move with its flow rather than against it. She learned how to heal wounds with the touch of river stones, how to summon the strength of the tides, how to hear the voices of the ancestors carried in the waves. Her body grew strong, her mind sharp. The weak, frightened girl who had been thrown into the river that night slowly faded away. In her place, a powerful young woman emerged, one with wisdom, courage, and a destiny greater than she had ever imagined. But even as she found peace beneath the water, she knew one thing: she would not stay hidden forever. Morning came softly, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink, but there was an unease in the air. The river, usually calm at dawn, whispered secrets to those who listened. It was as if the water itself held its breath, waiting. The first to see it was a fisherman, old and wise, his back bent with years of labor. He had cast his net into the river, as he did every morning, expecting nothing but fish. But what he pulled from the water sent a shiver down his spine. A scarf, not just any scarf, Zola's scarf. The delicate fabric floated, untouched, against the current, refusing to sink, refusing to be swept away. It was as if the river was holding onto it, refusing to let it go. The old man's hands trembled as he pulled it closer, his breath catching in his throat. "Come quickly," he called, his voice carrying across the village. "The river speaks." One by one, the villagers gathered, their faces filled with confusion, fear, and wonder. Mothers clutched their children, elders murmured prayers, and whispers filled the air like buzzing bees. "She was taken by the river," one woman muttered, her eyes darting from the scarf to the water. But why does it return her things? The spirits have accepted her, another whispered, voice trembling. They have claimed her as their own. But what if? An old man hesitated, looking around before lowering his voice. What if she returns? The crowd fell silent. The thought sent a shudder through them all. The river had taken Zola, yet here was her scarf, floating as if untouched by time. Could it mean she was still out there? Could she have survived? Or worse, could she return, not as the girl they knew, but as something else, a spirit, a force of vengeance? Fumiro stood among them, his face carefully composed, but deep inside his heart swelled with satisfaction. He had done it. Zola was gone, and with her, the prophecy that threatened his rule. He forced himself to sigh, shaking his head as if in grief. Poor child, he muttered, voice thick with false sorrow. The river has taken her. We must pray for her soul. Boule stood beside him, arms wrapped around herself, eyes fixed on the water. Her lips parted, but no words came. She had watched it happen. She had seen Zola's terror, heard her pleading, and yet she had done nothing. Now, as the village murmured about spirits and fate, something cold settled in her bones, a weight she could not shake. But then, a voice cut through the whispers. Elder Banzi, the oldest and wisest man in Lusaka. He stepped forward, leaning on his carved wooden staff, his eyes sharp and knowing. He looked at the scarf, then at the river, and finally at Fumiro. Do not be so quick to bury your sins beneath false tears, he said, his voice steady. The river sees all. The spirits are never blind. Fumiro stiffened, his lips pressed together, but he said nothing. The waters do not take without reason, Elder Banzi continued, turning to face the gathered villagers, and they do not return something unless there is unfinished business. A heavy silence fell over the crowd. The wind picked up, sending ripples across the water, as if the river itself agreed. Fumiro forced a laugh. Come now, Elder, he said, his voice light, though his fingers curled into fists. What is done is done. The girl is gone. Let us move forward. But Elder Banzi did not smile. His gaze remained firm, unshaken. Evil never goes unpunished, he said simply. Mark my words. The villagers exchanged uneasy glances. Even those who doubted spirits could not deny the strange feeling in the air. It was as if something was coming, something unseen, something powerful. And for the first time since throwing Zola into the river, Fumiro felt a sliver of fear. Zola's days in the depths of the river turned into weeks, then months, then years. Time flowed differently beneath the water, moving like a gentle current, shaping her into something new. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been thrown into the river at midnight. She had become something else, something stronger, something powerful. The river keepers became her family. They taught her the language of the water, the whispers carried by the currents, the songs woven into the waves. She learned how to listen, how to feel the river's pulse as if it were an extension of herself. Elder Mawira guided her with patience and wisdom, showing her the ways of the sacred waters. The river does not fight, he told her one evening as they stood on a shimmering sandbank beneath the glowing waters. It flows, it bends, it carries great power, yet it does not force. You must learn to be like the river, Zola. She nodded, her heart swelling with determination. Her training was not easy. She spent long hours moving with the currents, learning to control the water instead of letting it control her. She practiced the art of water healing, placing her hands over wounds and watching them close. As the river's energy flowed through her, she learned to summon the strength of the tides, to sense danger before it arrived, and to read the stories written in the waves. But her greatest lesson came from the river itself. One day, Elder Mawira led her to a part of the river she had never seen before, a place where the waters ran wild and untamed. The current was fierce, roaring like thunder, churning with an unstoppable force. It was dangerous, powerful, and unpredictable. You must cross, Elder Mawira said, his gaze steady. Zola hesitated. The river before her was nothing like the gentle waters she had come to know. It raged, daring her to step in. Fear whispered in her mind. What if I fail? She asked. Elder Mawira's eyes softened. Then you will try again. Taking a deep breath, Zola stepped forward. The moment her feet touched the water, the current pulled at her, testing her, challenging her. She fought against it at first, trying to push through with sheer strength, but it was useless. The river was stronger. It always would be. Then she remembered, the river does not fight, it flows. Closing her eyes, she let go of her resistance. She allowed the water to guide her, moving with it, instead of against it. And then, something incredible happened. The river no longer fought her. It carried her, lifted her. She moved across the wild waters with ease, feeling the power of the current not as an enemy, but as an ally. When she reached the other side, Elder Mawira smiled. "You are ready." That night, as the river shimmered under the moon's glow, Elder Mawira called her to him. He looked at her, not as a child, but as the woman she had become. "The time has come, Zola," he said. "You have learned the wisdom of the river. You have become one with its power. Now, you must return." Zola's heart pounded. Return, back to the world that had cast her away, back to the people who had left her to die. She clenched her fists. She was no longer the helpless girl Fumero had thrown into the river. She had been reborn. She had a purpose, and she would reclaim what was hers. The wind carried whispers through the village of Lusaka, murmurs of a drought that had tightened its grip on the land. The river, once full of life, had shrunk into a feeble stream. Crops withered under the scorching sun, and the once thriving fields now lay cracked and barren. Animals grew weak, and the people of Lusaka, once proud and strong, were now desperate. And then she arrived, draped in flowing blue robes that shimmered like the river under the moonlight. The mysterious healer walked through the dusty streets. Her presence was unlike anything the villagers had ever seen. She moved with quiet grace, her eyes deep and knowing, carrying the wisdom of someone who had seen beyond the ordinary world. Though she spoke little, the air around her seemed to hum with power, and the villagers could feel it, the presence of something greater than themselves. Words spread like wildfire. "A healer has come," they whispered. "She carries the spirit of the river." Mothers brought their sick children. Elders hobbled forward with trembling hands, and the once skeptical villagers bowed their heads in silent hope. But the moment Fumero and Bula heard the news, their blood ran cold. Fumero, who had once laughed in the face of fate, now sat frozen in his hut, his hands clenched into fists. His mind raced. It couldn't be. She was dead. He had made sure of it, hadn't he? Yet, when he stepped outside, his heart stopped. The woman standing before the crowd, the one wrapped in blue, the one touching the sick with a healer's hands, the one whose very presence made the villagers kneel in awe. She looked like her, like the girl he had thrown into the river at midnight. Bul gasped, gripping Fumero's arm, her fingers digging into his flesh. "It cannot be," she whispered, voice trembling. Fumero swallowed hard. It was impossible. The river had taken her. He had watched her disappear beneath the water, and yet the healer stood there, calm and unshaken, as if she had never left. But the village had no time for his fear. Their crops were dying. Their water was vanishing. Their very survival hung by a thread. "The gods have sent her," a desperate villager cried. "She is the one the prophecy spoke of, the child chosen by the river." A murmur of agreement spread through the crowd. Yes, the prophecy. A child with a sacred mark would return to restore balance. A child who had been lost to the river would rise again. Fumero's face darkened. His heart pounded like a drum of war. If the villagers believed she was the one foretold, they would bow to her, follow her, obey her. And if that happened, his control over the village would be lost forever. He forced himself to laugh, stepping forward with a sneer. "You all believe in old stories and shadows," he said, his voice sharp. "How do we know she is truly sent by the gods? How do we know she is not a fraud?" The healer turned her gaze on him. Her eyes, deep, endless like the river, met his, and for the first time in his life, Fumero felt small. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply smiled. And in that moment, the sky, which had been cloudless for months, rumbled. A single drop of water fell from the heavens, landing in the dust at her feet. Then another, and another, until the sky opened up and rain came pouring down, soaking the earth, filling the cracks, breathing life back into the dying land. The villagers gasped. They fell to their knees. "She is the one!" they cried. "She has returned!" And in that moment, as the rain washed over the village, Fumero knew his time was running out. The air in Lusaka was thick with the scent of fresh rain, and the villagers watched in awe as the once dry river began to flow again, its waters shimmering under the afternoon sun. Zola stepped forward, her blue robes clinging to her skin, her eyes locked onto the rippling surface. She knelt, dipping her hands into the cool water, whispering ancient words that only the river could understand. As she stood, the crowd erupted into cheers, chanting, "The chosen one has returned!" The river has accepted her. But amidst the celebration, Fumero could not move. His body had turned to stone, his throat dry despite the downpour that had drenched the land. His heartbeat pounded against his ribs as realization sank in. Zola was alive. The girl he had thrown into the river that fateful night had not perished. She had not been swallowed by the darkness. She had risen, and now she stood before him, more powerful than ever. Fumero's legs trembled, and his breath came in short, sharp gasps. He took a step back, but the villagers had already turned toward him. Their eyes, once filled with respect, were now sharp with suspicion. They had seen his fear. Elder Banzi, the village's oldest and wisest leader, narrowed his eyes. "Why do you tremble, Fumero?" His voice boomed. "What evil do you see in this child?" The crowd fell silent. Every pair of eyes turned to Fumero, watching, waiting. He opened his mouth, but no words came. His mind raced for an excuse, a lie, anything to free himself from the weight of their stares. But it was too late. A woman stepped forward, one of the village elders. Her voice cut through the silence. "She is the child from the river, the one you claimed was cursed." She turned to Elder Banzi. "We all remember the night she disappeared. We were told she had run away, but now she stands before us, blessed by the gods." Fumero lied. Murmurs rippled through the crowd. Whispers turned into accusations. Another voice rose. "What did you do to her? Where was she all these years? Why is he shaking like a coward?" The weight of their questions pressed down on Fumero's chest. His knees buckled. The ground beneath him felt unsteady. Elder Banzi's voice sliced through the noise. "Fumero, speak the truth. What happened to Zola?" The silence that followed was deafening. Then, suddenly, the river roared. The calm waters Zola had just blessed began to rise, swirling, churning, alive with fury. The villagers gasped as the current pulsed toward them, dragging at the ground beneath Fumero's feet. The river had not forgotten. Fumero collapsed to his knees, his hands clutching the earth, his face pale with terror. He gasped for breath, his mind spiraling. The river wanted him. It had come to claim him. Zola stepped forward, her voice calm but firm. "The river remembers all," she said, her gaze piercing through him. "It carries the truth. It does not forget betrayal." Fumero trembled, his lips parting in a desperate plea. "Please, have mercy." Zola tilted her head, watching him with unreadable eyes. Then, after a long pause, she lifted her hand, and the waters, though still raging, halted. She had spared him, but his punishment was far from over. Elder Banzi turned to the villagers. "This man," he declared, "has brought shame to Lusaka. He has betrayed the gods. He will live in disgrace." Fumero let out a strangled sob, his body sinking into the mud, his power shattered. Then, all eyes turned to Buell, the woman who had stood by in silence, the woman who had watched as a child was thrown into the river and did nothing. Elder Banzi's voice hardened. "And you, Beulah, you allowed this to happen. Your silence was your sin." The villagers murmured in agreement, stepping away from her as if her presence alone tainted the land. Beulah's lips quivered. "Please, I didn't—" "You did nothing," a villager spat. She looked around, searching for a familiar face, for someone to defend her, but no one did. Elder Banzi lifted his hand. "Leave this village. Your place here is no more." A sharp gasp rippled through the crowd. Buell collapsed onto her knees, but no one reached for her. She had sealed her own fate. And as Fumero lay in the mud, shivering, and Buell walked alone into the wilderness, Zola turned back to the river, her heart steady. Justice had been served. The village of Lusaka had not seen such abundance in years. The once dry fields were now lush with green, the river flowed freely, and the air smelled of fresh rain and blooming flowers. Life had returned, and at the heart of it all stood Zola. She walked through the village, no longer a forgotten orphan, no longer the girl discarded in the dead of night. She was now the guardian of the river, a woman whose presence alone brought peace and hope. The villagers bowed their heads in respect as she passed, their whispers filled with gratitude. "She saved us," they murmured. "She saved Lusaka." The river, which had once carried her away, now embraced her like a long-lost friend. It rippled gently whenever she approached, its waters reflecting the light of the sun like 1,000 diamonds. The children ran to its edge, splashing playfully, their laughter filling the air. They had no fear of the river anymore, for they knew it belonged to her now. Zola did not seek revenge. She did not gloat over those who had wronged her. Instead, she built something greater. By the river's edge, She constructed a healing sanctuary, a place where the sick and weary could come to be restored. The walls were made of smooth river stones, the roof woven from the strongest reeds. Inside, fresh herbs hung from the ceiling, their scents filling the air with warmth and comfort. She welcomed all, orphans, widows, the abandoned and forgotten. No one would suffer as she had. No child would be cast away like a curse. One day, an old woman arrived, her back bent with age, her hands shaking. She fell at Zola's feet, tears streaming down her face. "My daughter is sick," she wept. "The fever will not break." Zola knelt beside the woman, took her hands and smiled. "Bring her to me," she said gently. "She will not suffer." The woman's daughter was barely breathing when they carried her into the sanctuary. The villagers gathered outside, watching, hoping, praying. Zola placed her hands in the river, drawing the cool water into her palms. Then, softly, she touched the girl's forehead. The fever vanished instantly. The child's eyes fluttered open, her skin no longer burning. Gasps filled the air. The crowd erupted into cheers. "The river blesses her," they cried. "She is truly chosen." From that day on, people traveled from distant villages to seek Zola's wisdom, her healing touch. She was no longer just the girl who had survived. She was a legend. As the seasons passed, the village thrived under her care. Fields overflowed with crops, families prospered, and the river never dried again. It was as if Lusaka itself had been reborn. But Zola never forgot her past. Each night, she stood by the river's edge, her gaze fixed on the waters that had once been her prison. Now they were her home. One evening, a young girl approached her, timid and hesitant. "Lady Zola," she whispered, "I have no family. May I stay here?" Zola smiled, kneeling to meet the child's eyes. "You will never be alone again," she promised. And just like that, another lost soul found a home. As the moon rose over Lusaka, the river shimmered, as if blessing the guardian who had once been forsaken. Zola had risen, not as a victim, not as a forgotten child, but as a protector, a healer, a queen of the waters. Fumiro had always been a man who believed he could outsmart fate. He had spent years controlling others, weaving lies, and using fear to get what he wanted. But now, standing alone at the edge of the river, his time had run out. The villagers who once feared him now looked at him with disgust. The truth had been revealed. He was a murderer, a coward, a man who had tried to silence destiny itself. There was nowhere left for him to hide. Panicked, he turned and ran, pushing through the thick jungle, his breath ragged, his heart pounding. He had to escape. He had to get far away before the villagers decided to take justice into their own hands. But in his desperation, he failed to see where he was going. With one wrong step, his foot sank into the earth. The ground beneath him shifted soft and hungry. He tried to move, but the more he struggled, the deeper he sank. "No! No! Help me!" he screamed, his hands clawing at the dirt, his eyes wide with terror. But there was no one to save him. The river, the very thing he had used to discard an innocent girl, now watched in silence. The villagers stood at a distance, their expressions unmoved. "It is the river's will," Elder Banzi murmured. "Justice always finds its way." Slowly, the quicksand pulled Fumiro under. The last thing the villagers heard was his broken, desperate sobs before the earth swallowed him whole. Meanwhile, Boule stood frozen, her knees trembling. She had watched everything unfold, and now she was alone. The man she had chosen over her own stepdaughter was gone. All that remained was her guilt. Tears spilled down her face as she stepped toward Zola. The girl she had abandoned, the child she had allowed to be thrown into the river, now stood before her stronger than ever. "Zola, my child," Boule whispered, falling to her knees. "Please forgive me. I was blind. I let him deceive me. If I could take it back, I would." Zola's expression remained calm, unreadable. She had waited years for this moment, but now that it had come, she felt no joy, no satisfaction. "You did nothing to stop him," Zola said softly, her voice steady. "You turned away while I begged for my life." Boule sobbed, pressing her forehead to the ground. "I regret it every day. Please, tell me how I can make it right." Zola let out a slow breath, looking up at the river that had spared her life all those years ago. The water flowed gently, steady and eternal. "I cannot give you forgiveness," she said finally. "Only time can heal wounds. What you do from this moment on will determine who you truly are." Boule nodded, knowing that nothing she said could undo the past, but she had been given a chance to change. The villagers, who had once ignored Zola's suffering, now saw the truth. They had turned a blind eye when she needed them the most, but never again. "We will protect the innocent," Elder Banzi declared, his voice strong. "We will honor the river's prophecy. Never again will we let cruelty go unpunished." From that day forward, the village of Lusaka became a place of justice and kindness. The river, once feared, became sacred, and the story of Zola, the girl who had been thrown away but returned stronger than ever, became legend. The sun was setting over Lusaka, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. A soft breeze carried the scent of fresh rain, and the river, once a silent witness to betrayal and pain, now flowed with peace and harmony. Standing at its edge, Zola gazed at the shimmering waters, her heart full. She was no longer the frightened girl who had been dragged here in the dead of night, her feet bound, her life nearly stolen. She was no longer the helpless child who had cried out for mercy. She was Zola, the guardian of the river, the healer, the legend. The villagers gathered behind her, watching in awe. They had once whispered about her fate, fearing she had turned into a vengeful spirit. Now, they looked at her with admiration, respect, and gratitude. Because of her, their land thrived. Because of her, justice had been restored. Slowly, Zola knelt and placed her hand on the water's surface. The river responded instantly, a soft ripple forming beneath her touch. Then, as if recognizing its chosen one, a wave rose, a gentle glowing crest of water that shimmered like liquid silver. Gasps echoed among the villagers. Some fell to their knees, whispering prayers of thanks. Others wept, overwhelmed by the sight before them. "The river has embraced her," Elder Banzi murmured. "She was never lost. She was chosen." Zola closed her eyes, feeling the water's energy flow through her. She had spent years learning its secrets, understanding its wisdom. The river was more than just a body of water. It was life, memory, and justice. It had saved her, guided her, and now it welcomed her home. She opened her eyes and turned to face her people. "This river does not take, it gives," she said. "It protects the innocent and remembers the wicked. It is a guardian, just as we must be." The villagers nodded in solemn agreement. They had seen what happened to those who abused their power. They had learned the cost of silence and ignorance. Never again would they turn their backs on the innocent. As the last light of day faded, the river's glow lingered, a reminder that some spirits could never be drowned. Zola's story spread far beyond Lusaka, carried by travelers, spoken in hushed reverence around campfires. She had been thrown away, but she had risen stronger than ever. And now, she was eternal. No matter how much someone tries to destroy a destined soul, fate always finds a way. Zola was thrown into the river, meant to disappear forever, but destiny had other plans. She was chosen for greatness, and nothing, not cruelty, not betrayal, could take that away. Her story proves that no one can erase what is meant to be. Fumiro thought he had won, but evil always comes back. His wickedness led to his own downfall, showing that those who harm others will eventually face the consequences of their actions. The river, silent and patient, did not forget what he had done. When the time was right, it rose against him, proving that justice, though sometimes delayed, never fails to arrive. Zola's journey was not just about survival, but about the strength of kindness. Even after all the pain she endured, she did not let hatred consume her. Instead, she used her wisdom and power to heal, to bring prosperity, and to show that true strength is not in revenge, but in resilience. She turned her suffering into something greater, becoming the guardian of her people. The river was more than just water. It was memory, justice, and truth. It carried those who honored it and swallowed those who abused it. In life, every action has consequences, just like the river remembers all. And finally, the greatest lesson: never underestimate the rejected. Zola, once discarded, forgotten, and left to die, became the most powerful figure in Lusaka. Those who thought she was nothing lived to see her rise above them all. The world often casts aside the ones it fears the most, but in the end, the strongest always return.